Hello quilters, welcome back. We're now up to block 9 for our sampler quilt. That means we're more than halfway for making the 15 blocks that I mentioned earlier. Today's block is a very interesting one. You can see it right there. It's called Amazement. It's by Sue Beavers. And the intricate part about the block is that it has all of those indications of pieces being woven through each other. There's a lot of cutting. There are a lot of little pieces, but we can get this together, and together you and I will do just that. And so here's a close look at Amazement. And as you look at it, you can see that there are quite a few little squares that have to be cut and quite a few rectangles that have to be cut. And I'm going to move the cutting directions over in just a minute so that you can see what you have to cut from each color. Now the white background fabric is first, and here are the pieces you need to cut for that. And you start with 10 squares that are 1.5 by 1.5. Then you have 4 rectangles that are 1.5 by 2.5, and so forth. I'm going to go slowly with showing you the cutting directions because there are so many pieces to cut. Actually, I think it takes longer to cut the pieces out than it does to sew the quilt block together. So look very carefully. The first set of parts that you're seeing here represent the beige background that you see on the screen for the block. Then the next set, you're going to cut 2 fabrics. Notice that it says the light green and the blue. And let me move this over just a little bit. This is what is being called the light green right here, going through, and this is the blue, and you can see that. Once again, the light green and the blue. And so you see in your cutting directions that you will cut the same pieces for those 2 fabrics. Each will require 3 squares that are 1.5 by 1.5, 1 rectangle that is 1.5 by 5.5, 2 rectangles that are 1.5 by 3.5, and 1 rectangle that is 1.5 by 2.25. Then we move down to what you see here as the dark green. The dark green is this part right here that goes through the block on a diagonal. And so for that you need to cut 2 rectangles that are 1.5 by 3.5 and 2 rectangles that are 1.5 by 5.25. Next we're going to move down to the red. And the red is the square that goes through the block. Once again, it's the red square that you see in the block. And you can see other fabrics are woven in and under that. So for the red, you need 2 rectangles that are 1.25 by 3.5. 4 rectangles that are 1.25 by 4.25, and 6 rectangles that are 1.25 by 1.5. And the last color that we have to consider is the gold that you see on this diagonal. And the gold needs one rectangle that's 1.5 by 3.5, and two rectangles that are 1.5 by 6 3/4. And so that's the cutting, and I'm going to be putting the cutting up throughout the video. And when you see it, if you need to stop the video, which I would suggest you do that, so that you can get all of the cutting done that's necessary for this block. Now let's look at the construction directions. In a minute I'll show you my fabrics cut out, but I want you to see what we're going to do. These are the directions that we're given with the block. And if you notice, we can put those pieces together in segments and groupings. And that's exactly the way we're going to sew them together. And each time I pick up certain pieces, I'll tell you which grouping we're working on. My process for doing this is to start right here. And the first thing I'm going to do is put these three pieces together. That's a background, the blue, and background. And once I've sewn those three together, I'm going to attach a background to one red and sew them, and then sew that to the first group that I did. And I'll continuously tell you what I'm doing each time I pick up some of the pieces. I'll let you know exactly what I'm sewing together. And my goal is to sew all of the top together, and then to sew all of the bottom together, and then to attach them to the gold that's in the middle. So that's how we'll work. And I'm going to lay the pieces out that I have cut so that you can see those. The first thing I need to sew together is this little group right here. It has a background fabric, C, rectangle C. It has the light green, which in my case will be the beige fabric. And I'm going to use I think that's a C. So I go from, I'm sorry, the first one is G, then it's a C, and then one of our small triangles. Once again, look at that little cluster that I am going to sew together first. It's right here. It's this background, light green background. It's bar G out of the background, rectangle C out of the background, and triangle I out of the background. So we've got two background fabrics and one of the other color fabrics. I'll sew those and then show you what they look like. And if you're sewing along with me, do it that way. Just do exactly what I'm doing. Start small. This block requires us to take baby steps. But once we take our baby steps, we begin to see the block take shape. Here's our first unit sewn together. And I've pressed the seam allowances. And that's where we start. We've got background fabric. We've got in my case, the beige represents the light green on the picture, and a triangle. And once again, this is where I'm working. Right here. Background fabric, light green, background fabric, blue, in my case the beige, and the background. And it's one of the halves of the triangle that we just cut. Now the next piece that has to be attached, I have to put a piece of background fabric, one of the little 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares, onto my square fabric. As you see the square going around throughout the block. So here is the first part of the square that's going around the block that I'm going to work with. In my case, it's my dark green fabric and my blue fabric. This is where I'm going to have two African prints together. So here is the dark green fabric, and here is the little square that has to go on top of that. So I need to go to the sewing machine and sew those two pieces together. Here is the second unit, that's background and a place where we can see the square running across this piece. Now we're going to stitch these three together. And I'm going to remind you, don't try to match them up at the top. Something is going to stick up at the top. You're going to start your stitching at the bottom of the unit. Look at how it's lined up down here. That's where you want to start putting them together. See how they're lined up at the bottom? So you match the bottom of this to the bottom of that. Match the bottom of this one to the bottom of that, so that this is a straight line across. Don't worry about what's happening out here. Remember, eventually you are going to trim that off. So you want your sewing to start down here. Take your time, look at your pieces carefully, and you won't have any problems putting this together. Here's our unit. Can you see the square cutting across? See how it's weaving? Right here it goes across the background fabric, but the illusion is that it goes behind the blue fabric and then it comes out again across the background fabric. That's what you're doing. You're putting this together, creating an illusion that pieces are weaving in and out throughout the quilt block. So now that I have this unit together, it's time for me to sew it to this little unit that we did earlier. And can you see the weaving again? See how the blue is weaving under the beige? That's the whole joy of this block, is all of the weaving that's going on back and forth. See how the pieces weave under and over one another? That's what we are achieving by following this little guide here. And right now, this is where I am. I'm about to sew that unit to this unit right here. And you can see we're moving right across the top of our block. And pretty soon we'll be working down here. So I'm going now to sew these two units together. And the next thing I will have to do is attach one of my pieces of fabric for the square to another background fabric. This is all sewn together now, and we have one unit. And you remember the first unit we sewed together? Now it's time to attach these two. And it's going to be just so wonderful. You'll see you're creating, when you sew these together, you're creating where the square has one of its corners. Can you see that? And so we'll sew this together and you'll see how the square is turning a corner right there. Here we've sewn the first unit together with the last one that I completed. And if you look carefully, you can see where the square is turning the corner. We can see that. So I know because I have a dark fabric here, but it might be a little hard to see. But you're getting the weaving done. And this is why you want to take your time and sew as slowly as you can so that you match things. This, for instance, the top, this seam here, has to match the seam there so that we can really see our square turning its corner. Okay, now it's time to move on. I'm just going to set that down. And now I want to move to, let's see, I started here and I worked my way across. Now here I am at the green. And the green has the square cutting across it. So I have to put this part of the green with apart from the square with the other part of the green. And to help you with that, this bottom part of green is a C. This one for the square is an F. And then that one is B. So we've got C and B for the green and part F for the square. I'm going to sew those three pieces together and then join them to the part that we have already completed. Look at all of that. We've sewn all that together. And you will do the same thing. Just take your time. Look very carefully at this sheet. Keep stopping your video. Don't let the video just run. Look at the sheet so that you'll know where you are in the block and can sew the pieces together that are required. Here is this unit on our instruction sheet. It's green. It's the green right here. Remember, we worked our way across to that. We put this unit together. Then we put this little unit together. Then we sewed these three A's and this C together. Then we made this unit to make sure that the square is weaving through. And we sewed all three of these together along with what we had done previously. Now we're ready to sew the green onto that whole unit that we've completed. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what we've done. You can see that very clearly. And now it's time to let the square weave above in the picture it's green, on mine it's red. And I need to get this. And once again, we're going to line things up from the bottom and not worry about the top, because the tops are not going to be even. Remember, I told you that. And I know that looks like a shaggy mess. It did to me too the first time I made this. But trust me, if that's what you see, then you're doing it correctly. Okay, I need to get these sewn so that I can show you this. So here we go. Here is half of the top of our block. Takes a while to get there because we have so many little pieces. You want to sew this in such a way that you match up that square that's going around. You want the pieces to match. Kind of hard to see with the fabric. I've put it in here, but it does match as it goes across. Now it's time for us to address the second half of the top of the block. And here we go. We're going to start right here. I have a background fabric A, and I have a blue. In my case, remember that's beige. I have a blue A, and I need to sew those two little squares together. And once I've done that, then I'm going to attach a beige C to the two of them. So this is the next unit we're going to put together. This little square with this little square. Press the seam allowance and then attach that C right there. Here's the unit I was just talking about. I have a background A. I have it's blue on the picture, but I have a beige A. And then I have this beige B. So let's look at this on our diagram. Background A, blue and blue in my case is beige and beige. And so the next thing I need to do is go back to my background. And I need a background B and a background C. And I'm going to sew the B to this unit first, and then sew the C to the unit. And we'll have that whole little cluster completed. Here is that little cluster. We finished that. And now it's time for us to put part of the square on it. You know, the square that's going through the block. And we're going to do that by attaching a square piece here. And once that's attached and the seam allowance is pressed, we will attach the other one to the side. And here again, we're at the corner, one of the corners of the square. And let me show you that on the direction sheet once more. This is where we are. We've completed this cluster. I've sewn the background B and C onto it. Now I'm going to sew the square onto it by sewing this one at the top first and then the one on the side. Here is our little unit with the corner of the square attached to it. And so now let's look at what we do next. We're almost through with the top of the block. This is where we are. This is what I've already completed. And now I'm going to sew the two triangles. These are the two larger triangles that you see on the side of the block. I'm going to sew them to that whole unit that I just created. This is what I'm talking about. You see the big triangles? That's what will go on next. Before I stitch this, I want you to see what we're going to do with these triangles. One of them will be placed right here. Well, let me start up here. Yeah, I can see it better that way. One of them gets placed there and you sew it on. And the other one gets placed right here. And it's interesting that this block has a bias edge running along the outside. So that's what I needed to stop to point out to you. Handle this as little as possible because we've got a bias edge out here. And I tried it earlier when I made the block to turn it other ways, and it's designed to go this way. So be very careful about that bias edge that's going to be on the outside of your block. And when you finish making the block, handle that block very, very carefully and almost none at all, really, until you are ready to sew your blocks together, because that's what we have working with it. Okay, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and get the triangles sewn on. Here we are. Both triangles have been sewn to the block, to that unit, I'm sorry. And now it's time for us to connect what we had already sewn to what we just completed. And that goes on like this. Here are the two parts of the top of the block. See if I can get them in my hand. Right here. And we're going to sew those together. You see how the beige is weaving in and out, as well as the square. And maybe if I could just leave it down here on the table, you could see it more easily. But this is where we are with our block. And I'll leave this, oh, that you can't see that. Put it this way. And so I'm going to sew a seam that connects this unit that I just finished with the one I had done previously. And that seam is going to go right down here. Before I do that, I hope you can see how the square is weaving. I hope you can see how the beige is weaving. And when we finish the bottom of the block, you'll see more weaving by this light blue and the beige. And here is our sheet to tell us that we're on the right track. Right here. I just finished that unit. I've already sewn this middle down here, and in my case, it isn't green, it's red. Now I'm going to sew this whole unit to the red that was previously attached to this side of the top of the block. And the whole top half of the block will be completed. Here we have the top half of our block. And you saw me sew all of these pieces together, ending over here where I added the large triangles. And you should be able to see the square going through the block. You should be able to see how the beige is weaving in and out, how the light blue is weaving in and out. And so now we're going to do basically the same thing to complete the bottom of the block. And I like to start with that first cluster just like I did at the top. And here it is. We're at the bottom, and I'm calling it the bottom because it's on the bottom half of this gold divider. So this is where I'm going to start with that first little cluster. Remember, I started here to complete the top. Now I'm going to do basically the same thing, but notice we have a color change. We've got background, blue, background. Up here I had background, beige, background. So I'm going to sew this little cluster together, and then the next thing I have to do is add part of our square. Here is our first little cluster. Background, blue, background, and I added the first part of our square. And here I am right here on the sheet of directions. Here's that little cluster that I did, and you can see the first leg of the square there. Now, the next thing I need to do is very similar to what I did up here. I need to sew these three squares together. It's a background, a blue, a background. And so I'm going to sew those together and then attach the light green. I've put our little unit together, the three squares and the blue rectangle. And now I'm getting it ready to sew on to the next unit. This is where I am in the directions. I've sewn these three squares together, and you can see them. They are A. Then I put the blue on, I put the blue on, and now I have constructed this piece where it's an A, it's part of the square, and then a G, and I have this blue, and I have also sewn this together, and they are right here on the table. This is the piece that I had sewn previously, and here you can see A square, B, and then I've got this white in between that represents the blue that's on the sheet, and a similar piece over here with an A, part of the square, and a G. And so now I need to sew these three together. And once I've done that, I can sew them to this little unit. Here is this unit sewn together. The three A's at the bottom, the blue C, and then we have these two units on either side that have part of the square running through them. Now we're ready to attach this to the very first unit we did. very similar to when we were working on the top. You can see that it is a corner of the square. So we sew these two together and we will have finished half of the bottom of our block. Here are those two units sewn together. You can see the corner of the square. You can see how the blue and the white are weaving through, over and under. And now all I need to do for this part of the square, of the block, is sew the middle part, this one, the red. So I'm going to sew these together and then put that on here. Here we are. This is bottom half of the, half of the bottom of our block. And now we just have to complete one more part of it and we will have the whole block together. So the next part, I'm just going to sit this over here. Now here we are on our instruction sheet. We have completed this part. All of this has been done. And the next thing we need to do is the part that has the large triangles on the outside. And we're going to start it exactly the way we started this one. If you notice, I've got some little squares. I've got an A and an A. One is background fabric. One is the light blue. And so I'll sew those two little squares together. Then I will put the light blue on top of them. Then I'm going to add background, background, and then square fabric, and then the two triangles. The process is the same for the bottom of the quilt as it is for the top of the quilt. The only difference is the placement of the colors. The colors do change when they get to the bottom based on how they are weaving in and out of the block. But the process for sewing it together is exactly the same as it was for the top. So I'll get started right here on this little unit. We have almost finished our block. Here is the top half of the block, and I have completed the bottom half of the block. And remember, you sew everything together down here the same way that you sewed it there, except changing the position of your colors. And now we're ready to put the last piece on the block. Notice that I have to match one more time the blue over here and the beige there, and this is where I am on the direction sheet. You see the gold bar that goes across the middle diagonally? Notice that it has a little square A that matches the color here, and it has a square A that matches this color right here. And so we're going to sew that on and sew the two halves of the block to it, and we will be through, and I'll show you how we trim this block. Here is our completed block. I had already put the pink in the middle, going on one diagonal, and now I have attached the orange or the gold and red in the middle on the other diagonal. And so if you turn the block the way it is here, you can see how this beige cuts through like the blue does, and how this pale blue cuts through just like that dark blue does. And I'm just so impressed with it. I love the design. I love the fact that it was in the book. Normally I don't make quilt blocks that have a lot of little pieces. I find them kind of tedious and intimidating. But I liked this block so much when I saw it that I couldn't resist. So here it is, and I'm going to show you how we trim it and so show you the other one that I made as well. I tend to use the triangles as my guide for trimming. So I come out to the edge and make sure everything is straight. And that's the first trim. Now I can turn it, make sure that edge is on a straight line on my cutting board. And I'm going to use the edge of this little triangle right here, which is also a bias edge, by the way. But I'm going to use that as my guide for trimming the next side. There are no directions on how to trim it. The directions just say trim. And I want to make sure I don't trim it too small because I want a 12.5-inch block so that it will be the same size of all of my other blocks and will fit easily into my sampler quilt. And now that I'm trimming it, I hope you can see the block emerging. And we've done 3 sides, and here we are with the 4th side to be trimmed. And it's really a very, very beautiful block. Please don't let the number of pieces sway you from not doing it. I just think all of us should try it. Prayerfully, I've given you directions well enough that you will feel confident to try this. But here we are with block 9, and block 9 is called Amazement, and there is our amazement. Now, you remember from the introduction that I'm going to make 2 of each block because I want 30 blocks in the end, and so I did make another one. Very similar to this one, except I used the beige fabric as the background. And of course it's less busy because the background isn't busy. But it does have all of the intersecting pieces that the original block had and that the block had that I made with you. So here is Amazement. I think the name is very appropriate. I was amazed that I was able to put it together, and then I was amazed that I chose a block that had all of these little pieces. I am going to show you the cutting directions again while the music plays, and I will also show you this sheet again while the music plays. This is the only set of directions that we get for making this block, so I do want you to have this. Copy it down however you can get it. I'm not technologically savvy enough to put it somewhere that you can get it, but make sure you stop the video and look at this very carefully because this is your set of directions for assembling this block. Thank you so much for sewing along with me, and I will show you the directions and the cutting instructions right now.